We're going to finish today with a panel on the top two, and to moderate that is Shaudi Falamaki Fulp, who is a member of the IGS National Advisory Council. She previously was a lobbyist and strategist for Chevron Corporation, and then in 2012 started her own firm, the Fidens Group. Shaudi.
Great, thanks, Ethan, and thank you to all of you for sticking around on a Friday afternoon. We're calling this the cocktail panel, so yeah, so we just are absent alcohol, but okay. So we're going to talk about the top two. For many of you who may not know, but the fact that you're here, you probably do. The top two vote getters, regardless of party, are now in the general election. So now we have same party races, which we did not have previously. So we're going to have a very similar format. We're going to have all of our speakers have opening remarks, then have a discussion, and then open it up to you. But first, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Eric McGhee, here to my left, is a research fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. He's one of the state's most respected and prolific thought leaders on elections, redistricting, and political behavior. Prior to joining PPIC, he was an assistant professor at the University of Oregon and has a PhD from this esteemed institution, UC Berkeley.
Go Bears.
Yeah, go Bears. Ruth Bernstein, who's with EMC Research, has over 20 years of experience in survey work. With a background in economics, she brings a unique perspective to the research field. And in this last campaign, she worked with Tom Torlakson for his race for superintendent of public instruction, Mark DeSaulnier's bid for Congress, and newly elected Assemblyman Tony Thurmond's successful race for the legislature. Courtni Pugh here is a partner with Hilltop Public Solutions, which she joined after serving as executive director of SEIU Local 99. She's played a key role in some of the labor community's most successful campaigns and has served as an advisor to many Democratic presidential campaigns. Christy Wilson is president and CEO of Wilson Public Affairs, which she brings more than 15 years of experience in ballot initiative and legislative advocacy campaigns. She's got a stellar record representing the business community, and her clients include the Cal Chamber and many others. And Steve Glazer, last but not least, is president of Glazer and Associates and also the mayor of neighboring city of Orinda, where he's serving his third term. Most recently, he was a Democratic candidate for the 16th Assembly District, which we've talked a lot about already. So it should be an interesting panel. So without further ado, Eric's going to present.
So I'm going to give a real kind of bird's eye view of the top two, sort of set the stage for the discussion we're going to have. And as part of that, I want to talk about a number of different aspects of the top two. I'm probably going to have too many slides, so I'm going to try to get through them as quickly as I can. First, I'm going to talk about primary election outcomes, some general stats about those, as we've seen it both before and after the top two. Then general election. And then talk a little bit about crossover voting, what we know about it so far. Crossover voting being when partisan of one party votes for a partisan candidate of the other. And also the concept of undervoting, where you have some voters just abstain from a race entirely. And then discuss a little bit of what we know so far about the impact of the top two on moderation, which I think is kind of the $64,000 question, and then wrap it up. So first of all, in terms of primary outcomes, one of the things about the top two, and this has been discussed in some of the earlier panels, is that it at least creates the potential for a second bite at the apple. So if you are going to run against an incumbent of your own party, if you're under an old system that's sort of where the top vote getter within each party advances to the fall, then if you don't manage to come in first in your party, that's it, you're done. Under the top two, you do sometimes get a second chance. There's been some examples of that we've already seen as the top two has played out. Eric Swalwell versus Pete Stark is one from 2012. Kana versus Honda in 2014. Both examples where one candidate from within the party challenged an incumbent, didn't get first in the first round, but still got another chance as a same party race to contest that incumbent in the fall. And what we've seen is that because of that, it reshuffles the incentive structure, and incumbents are more likely to be challenged. So that's one thing. The biggest boost was in 2012 when we had new districts as well, but it's been visible in 2014 too. Primary races have also been somewhat closer, so the margin of victory both between number 1 and number 2, which is the people who are going to advance, but also between 2 and 3, which distinguishes the ones who are going to go on and the ones who are going to stay home. That margin has been smaller under the top 2 than before, at least so far. That said, so there's a little more competition, there's more candidates coming out. But establishment candidates have generally done well. That's also been alluded to earlier in some of the earlier panels. All incumbents have at least advanced to the fall campaign. And a large percentage of non-incumbents who are endorsed by a party have also advanced. So they tend to do pretty well when they get that endorsement. And at the same time, some types of candidates that you would consider being outsiders, third-party candidates, and particularly no-party preference candidates who many people were hoping would be benefited by this system. No-party preference, independent candidates who aren't taking a party label. They just really haven't done very well, and where they have advanced to the fall, it's been in races where there wasn't one of the major parties wasn't present. So what about general election outcomes? Well, the big thing there that we can talk about is just that there's a lot more competitive races. Now, a big piece of that is the redistricting, especially in the House of Representatives. There's just the new redistricting plan is much more competitive than the old one. But also in the Senate and the Assembly, there's just the average margin. Certainly the number of races that are decided by a relatively narrow margin has gone up. And then more to the point in terms of the discussion about the top 2, about 1/3, 30% of the same party races have been decided by less than 10 points. When you consider that these have almost universally occurred in districts that would not have been competitive in the fall otherwise, that's a big change. That's almost all net gain in terms of the top 2. So what about crossover voting? Like, are voters responding and crossing over? The answer is basically that you see about the level of crossover voting in the primary that you would see in a general election, somewhere in that ballpark. It's kind of in the teens. So the top one there is from a paper actually co-authored by IGS's very own Jack Citron. He's part of the et al., but that doesn't mean he's not important. So there was showing that they did a survey of people for voting in House and Senate races, state Senate races, and found a fair amount of crossover voting there. Not enormous, but a fair amount. There's a paper I saw that had survey data from the Bigelow-Aller race in 2012, where 19% of Democrats in that survey were willing to make a decision between one of those two candidates. And then the Brown-Kashkari-Donnelly decision, again, in both the field poll and the PPIC poll, we saw a fair amount of crossover voting. At the same time, again, there's sort of a flip side to all this. You can explain about 90% of the variation in outcomes under the top 2. That is the partisan outcomes. How many votes the Democratic candidates got, how many votes the Republican candidates got in the primary stage. You can predict that with party registration, about 90% of that variation. By comparison, under the old system where, essentially, except for independents, the amount of crossover voting by independents race to race, it was pretty much 100% predictive power. It was actually about 97% of variation was explained. It's down. So we're not explaining as much. There's more kind of uncertainty going on, but we're still explaining an awful lot. So that means crossover voting is it's not necessarily changing the baseline prediction we would have for a race, knowing nothing else about it. Undervoting. So this is where people just decide not to make a decision in a particular contest. What we've seen is, these are actually 2012 numbers. I haven't updated these for 2014, but I've seen some that, some sort of bits and pieces that look similar. The basic story here is voters turn out to vote in same-party contests as much as they do in cross-party contests, but they vote for the top-line races, they vote for president, they vote for Senate. They are more likely to skip the same-party contest. So, take that or leave it. The final issue is moderation. Has this had some effect on the performance of moderates in campaigns? And we can kind of look at that question a variety of different ways. And the papers, the research that's been done on this has kind of taken it at different angles on this question. The first is, do voters see these distinctions between the candidates and lump onto the moderates? And the answer, again, going back to the paper by Jack Citron et al., is not really. So they had a survey where they had, so along the, I can use my pointer, along here, this is a sort of more objective measure of ideology. They had a couple of different ways of doing that, but it comes up with a pretty good gauge. And up here is how the voters perceive those candidates. If there was a strong relationship between those two things, so that the candidates who were more conservative were perceived as more conservative by the voters, then that dotted line that's in the middle there should kind of go up like this, right? Or it should at least tilt, and it doesn't. So there's really not much of a relationship there, and you can kind of see that it's kind of messy. My favorite part of this is these two. So that looks like Chinese or something, but it's actually two names that are on top of each other. The one that's interesting to me is Chris Mitchum. He was a Tea Party candidate in the 24th district. Abe Maldonado was essentially in many respects, the father of the top two primary, and next to maybe Arnold Schwarzenegger, the most famous moderate Republican in the state. And while this objective measure says these two candidates are very different, Mitchum is more conservative than Maldonado, voters didn't see any difference between the two of them. So they couldn't distinguish between the Tea Party challenger and the most famous moderate Republican in the state. And that's the challenges that you're confronting. The second question is, did candidates take different positions under the top two than they did before? Again, the evidence we have so far is not really. Now bear with me as I walk through this particular slides. These lumps. There's a red lump, which is the distribution of candidate ideology. This is based on surveys of the candidates in 2010, and the blue lump is the distribution in 2012. 2012. These are House candidates, and the closer the lump is to the center of each graph, each of these four graphs, the more moderate that those candidates were. And what you see is that while there's just a lot of overlap between the two of them, so they're not always all that different. And where they are different, there's sort of one where this lump is a little closer to the middle. But generally speaking, there's at least as many examples of the red lump being closer to the middle. So there's not much clear evidence that, as a whole, the candidates are taking different positions on the campaign trail. And then the final question, and I think this is arguably the most important one from a policy standpoint, are the candidates behaving differently in office? And I think there the evidence is more mixed. There's a paper by Christian Gross down at USC he compared the 2011 first session of the 2011 legislature to the first session of the 2013 legislature, sort of a before and after. And what he found is that the polarization in the legislature was a lot smaller after the reforms. And there's a lot of people who have noted that and have commented on it, more sort of anecdotally. At the same time, if you look, so this is just one cut at looking at a longer time series, a longer perspective. This is Chamber of Commerce scores. And at the top there, This is the Republican caucus in the Assembly. And you can see since the early 90s, or late 80s, early 90s, Republicans have become more conservative, and Democrats sort of become more liberal, but not significantly. More like the Democrats jump up and down. The closer these blue lines are to the center, the more moderate the Democratic caucus. The closer the red lines are to the center, the more moderate the Republican caucus. And what we're seeing is Republicans really haven't changed much at all under the top two. Democrats are much more moderate, and just one of the most moderate points in the entire period of time. But the timing is a little off, right? So they were more moderate before the reform went into effect. And that comparison of 2011 to 2013 picks out a legislature that was particularly liberal. So I would say that we don't quite know enough yet to be able to say that it does appear that there is more support for the chamber's agenda in the legislature today, and the same thing you can see for the Senate. But it's too early to say that the top two, or really any of the electoral reforms, are specifically the cause. And so we need to, there's kind of the standard academic cop-out is to say we need more research, but I think it's actually true here. We do need more research on that subject. So in general, I would say at this point, the change is notable, meaning that there are some cases where it's a big deal, but it's not dramatic because the overall pattern across the entire state has not shifted considerably. So there's closer outcomes. As I said, the establishment candidates did pretty well at the same time. And I'd say the biggest differences are that the third-party presence in the fall election is pretty bad, and that these same-party races are truly an innovation and have really shaken things up. And I think consultants are still trying to figure out, and candidates are still trying to figure out what they're going to do with these same-party races. And then representation, we do see some signs of moderation in the legislature, but it's not clear yet if the top two is the cause, and I think the jury is still very much out on that. And that's it.
And so now we've got Ruth, who also has some slides for us. Nice job.
Thank you. I'm a pollster, so I don't really know how to talk unless I actually have slides and charts and things. So thank you again for all being here on a beautiful Friday afternoon when you could be somewhere else. So of course we all love to talk about politics all the time. So thanks for being here with us to do this. So what I want to talk a little bit about, I know we've talked a lot today about outcomes and kind of what happened. I want to take you a little bit inside, what do we actually do? So as a pollster, we're back at the very beginning looking at a race and trying to figure out, no matter whether it's top two or, we've gone through all kinds of different primary structures in the 20 years that I've been polling here in California. We had straight party primaries. We had the primaries with independents that could choose. Now we've got top two. In local races, we do, we've got ranked choice voting. We've got open primaries basically in county supervisor races and other things. So what we're looking for is, well, how does our candidate win? And that's always the goal, right? So what we want to look at, in these top two races, there's definitely some new things that we have to take into account, and some things that now we've had 2 years, which isn't a lot, but that we have to kind of consider and do differently on the front end. One of the big things that we have to take into account now, and that because, and we'll go through some of the numbers, a big piece is the filing deadline. So when actually, it's about 3 months before the election, is when the filing deadline for when the candidates actually get to file their papers. And as you've seen in the results, and we'll talk about a little bit today, the number of candidates has a huge impact, in many cases, on the actual outcome of the race. So when you have multiple Republicans in a race, it makes it less likely that a Republican is going to get enough votes to get into second place. The same thing, you have multiple Democrats. And so sometimes we're very, very early in a race, everyone's talking about, oh, it's a race between this person and this person. It's, the two front runners or the two Democratic front runners. And then all of a sudden, other people file at the last minute. Or we're polling and we think only one Republican is going to get in the race, and all of a sudden now 3 Republicans file. And you don't, we don't always think it's a big deal, but when you're running a whole campaign, sometimes a year ahead of an election, and then at the last minute, a few months out, basically the whole structure can change. And so, it's just a big consideration. Party registration, as Eric said, that the party breakdown of a district is still the best predictor kind of overall what's going to kind of happen, of where the vote's going to fall. That's not 100%, and I'm talking, about the primaries really. When you total the percentage of all the votes that the Democrats get in a race and the Republicans get in a race, it lines up not 100%, not always, but very closely with registration. And so you can sort of start to see some trends as you're getting into a primary election. Obviously, turnout is a factor. The big differences in turnouts is really about primary election, presidential elections, non-presidential elections. It of course can make a difference. You have to take that into account. And then another big factor that you have to take into account in these races early on is resources. So you might be having to go against each other again. And that's of course always been true in a primary and a general. You never know if you're going to make it through the primary. But you may be running the whole same race again. If you look at San Francisco and the Assembly District, how much resources do you use when you've got Campos versus Chu in a June election, and you're going to almost for sure, because there's 3 candidates that are running, that you're going to run that same race again. So how do you use your resources wisely, knowing that you're going to basically do the same thing? When you can't actually win in June, even though you're going to be doing it again. So a couple of when we actually looked at what really happened. So some races really aren't actually that different. Maybe they seem different, but really what happened was a primary among Democrats and a primary among Republicans, and the Democrat and the Republican ran against each other. A good example, CD31, that in 2012 was kind of a unique situation in that 2 Republicans wound up running against each other because there were so many Democrats on the ballot. And then this year again, or in 2014 again, in the primary, there were a lot of candidates, but there were multiple Republicans, and so we wound up with a Democrat against a Republican, and then the Democrat won in the end. So in some ways, this is really what happened in 2012. I get my years confused because I'm getting old. In 2012, there were only 2 Republicans on the ballot. Combined, they didn't spread the vote out enough. There were so many Democrats that ultimately 2 Republicans went on and then won, and then this time there were 3 Republicans. The vote was more spread out. The Democrat, squeaked by in the primary and then eventually won in the general. So really what that was is a primary and a general, and the 2 parties. It's kind of very similar the way it was. And then the other typical thing that we had, and I kind of just pulled random examples here, was the kind of expected single party general. So when we have in the very, very lopsided registration. So CD17 is an example of that. The Democratic registration is 44, Republicans only 19%. Very, very skewed, very lopsided. In that case, what we saw is what we expected. We got a Democratic Party runoff. So we had the Honda-Khanna race. There were actually, in that case, 2 Republicans. It is possible that if there had been only 1 Republican, it's possible that Republican would have gotten in the runoff. But in this case, it kind of was the expected Democratic runoff. The same thing happened in 80-15. The registration there is even more lopsided. It's 64 Dem, 7 Rep. They had a really, really good chance of taking that seat. And in that case, a Republican did file, and that's what was expected. It was going into this race, everyone expected, this is a Democratic fight. It's going to be a fight between Eccles and Thurman. That is what happened. The 2 came out, they went on, and Thurman won. So, that was kind of an expected, and I think this is why top 2 we kind of said, look, a Republican's never going to win this election, so let's actually have a debate between two Democrats, and that's what happened. But then sometimes you have kind of another example of very lopsided registration in SD 10 in the East Bay. Democrats 50, Republicans 17. In that case, there was only one Republican that ran. Now this, we can talk all about the Mary Hayashi and the situation, why she didn't win. But what happened really, one Republican ran. There are enough Republicans in this district, and and then we get Wachowski running against a Republican. Wachowski wins easily in the end. But it was sort of an unexpected. People kind of went into this thinking, well, this is going to be a Dem on Dem fight. That's what this seat is, a Dem seat, because you only got one Republican. It didn't happen that way. The other thing we see, and Eric mentioned this as well, is that front-runner status is really, really hard to overcome. You're going to start seeing that. We're already seeing that as we look at the boxer seat Senate race. We have a front-runner, and then there's going to be a Republican, and the Republican will get a percentage of the vote. When you already have a front-runner, there's a reason why people are dropping out of running in that race. There's not that much room left. So when you already have a front-runner. We saw that as well in some other races. So we worked with Eric Swalwell. We could, going back to 2012, he did challenge sort of a front-runner who kind of fell apart. And so Eric managed to get one, which was exciting. But then Ellen Corbett challenged him and hoped that she was going to be able to take that to a general election, a one-on-one race. There was one Republican. The Republican was able to inch out, and it became a very easy race for Swalwell to win. We saw the same thing, a minor assembly race that nobody cares about maybe, but except Levine, the labor interests were actually very keen on not keeping Levine in the assembly. There was talk about running a candidate in the primary against him and actually coalescing one Democrat to try to get into the runoff and try to get him out of office. Unfortunately, though, there was a diffusion of support, and 3 Democrats got into the race, and it was too hard to get past the one Republican. Even with a registration of 54-18, the Republican was able to get enough vote. The other 3 candidates really couldn't raise enough money to get their word out. So that's actually all I have. So I'm going to turn it over.
Thank you, Ruth. So now we have the practitioner, or just on the ground here. Ruth, of course, is a pollster here, and of course a practitioner, but the labor and business approach now with Courtni and Christy.
Thank you, and I think I want to, everyone can hear me echo several things that people have already said. One is, really glad to be doing this panel at 4:30 on Friday. I'm sure many of you want to have a cocktail, so do we. But speaking more on behalf of the Democratic side and having done a lot of on-the-ground campaigns in labor, in terms of the top 2, I think you have to ask, to who did it matter? Certainly, we've talked about turnout. Did it matter in terms of actual voter turnout? Did it matter to the candidates? What does it mean for the Democratic Party? Or Democratic identified candidates? There's a lot of good government talk, and so I just want to briefly go through some of those things fairly quickly. On turnout, a good place to start is, did it matter to overall turnout? I think many people have already said that it did not, and as the 58% of the state's electorate who skipped this November election can tell you, the answer is no. There were a lot of promises that the top 2 would turn out the rising electorate of non-primary party independents, decline to state, disenfranchised voters, millennials, young people in droves, and it really just simply didn't happen. I would say that, while the proponents vastly overestimated that those various sectors were going to dramatically increase, at the end of the day, it's the same thing for the very voters. Do they know what they're voting for? Do they care? And how does it affect their life today? We, just sort of case in point, we all knew this panel, the panel before us, the panel I'm sure earlier today and tomorrow, you'll have a whole thing on turnout. So I won't go into a lot of it, but we, did a lot of opinion research. I'm just struck in one of the primarily first generation Latino. We did focus groups in a couple of counties, specifically on turnout. Like, there are all these things of, will public peer pressure matter? Will the fact that we can actually say you and your neighbors voted, 20 times last cycle, yet you didn't, about community representation. At the end of the day, what kept coming up over and over was, how does me voting in this election actually better my life? And what are these people really going to do? And it really didn't differentiate overly between state senate, U.S. congressional, really don't know the names of folks. And it was really about, my future and have they ever walked a day in my shoes? And so I would argue it's those kinds of things. And obviously, at the top of the ticket, is there something that's competitive, that's big? We're going to maybe have a competitive presidential. We certainly have had, competitive gubernatorials or other kinds of things. And that certainly, most would argue, does absolutely drive turnout. So again, the top two didn't matter to who in terms of increasing turnout. I would say really didn't save democracy. Try again. When it comes to candidates, it certainly mattered to them. I think you can just ask former Assemblymember Raul Bocanegra. If I would argue if he was not in the top two, and if it was the previously traditional closed primary, that he would have won that primary and not have to spend another 150 plus days getting elected into the general, but that wasn't the case. There are multiple theories how Patty Lopez ousted Assemblymember Bocanegra, and I don't think any of them have really approved to this day to have put their finger on one button. Was it ballot placement or whatever it was? But I do think that most would agree if there was a close primary that the former Assemblymember would be here today, and I'm sure he is looking at coming back. In fact, in 18 top two contests for the state legislature, the 5 top vote getters in June were not elected in November, and many of them, not to mention the many June winners who held on to them, had to spend an additional 154 days on the campaign trail versus preparing to govern post-primary election. So if the goal of the top two was to make the candidates' lives a little bit harder and have a prolonged election campaign season, I think that might be mission accomplished. Going on to the Democrats, to my party, to the top two matter to Democrats. I think the evidence is becoming increasingly clear that this new system isn't really giving us a clear advantage, simply because I think it is a bigger distraction for Democratic candidates. Of the 18 top two contests for state legislatures, 13 involved 2 Democrats, or more than 70% of the folks on this year's cycle or last year's cycle. So that is 13 places where candidates could have been focused on helping Democrats maintain the supermajority, but instead were focused on their own survival all the way from June to November. Elections were also more costlier. Independent Expenditure Committee spent more than $11 million in the general election on Dem versus Dem contests. There were more than $2 million in REAP versus REAP contests, and there were certainly some targeted Democrat versus Republican contests that on top of that, there's additional tens of millions of dollars spent. So, the top two appears to have encouraged, frankly, increased divisive partisan fights for Democrats in some cases. not all the way, but when many of these seats are top two and dumb seats, we have to fight 2 elections all the way through. So I think it has made the Democratic Party endorsement probably, and Republican as well, but if you're fighting on sort of a dem-on-dem seat here, it's actually made it worth more and much more valued. I'm looking around if Shonda Wesley's around here. But the CDP endorsement and saying, particularly to the electorate that doesn't live, eat, and breathe like probably many of you in here do sort of our election season and who the candidates are, they do look for who the Democratic Party endorsed candidate is. And so in the primary, 96% of the Democratic candidates that were endorsed by the CDP went past the primary. For consultants like myself and many others, it has mattered. I don't know that any of them who do politics and campaigns for a business were overly excited about the term limits, but now we have the top 2 over and over, and so you always are looking for increased, and I'm looking at several people laughing here, increased additional candidates, and it's been good for business, but, and I'm looking at the sign here, but I would argue, everyone that said this was going to increase election turnout, it was going to increase quantifiably good government and all of those things. I'm not sure that that actually happened and the jury's still out.
Well, I'm going to probably echo a lot of other things that folks have said, but at this point, but Eric brought up an important point, as did Courtni here. There's a bigger picture. There are other things going on when top 2 primary came to be. We also had redistricting. We also have term limits. So all 3 of those things are playing together, and that's really starting to change the face of how you elect people, what those races look like, how you engage in them, and why you engage in them. So, for example, the term limits, as Courtni just mentioned, you get more incumbents. We still see that incumbents are favored into a general election. So 2014 and 2016 elections are going to be really important to what the makeup of the legislature looks like for the next 10 years. And I think if they're going to moderate and there's going to be classes of people that work together for 10 or 12 years, that you may see changes in how people legislate. But I think it's really far too early to know the answer to that. And additionally, in terms of top 2, I think you have to keep in mind expectations about what people really thought. I don't think anyone from the political establishment when that was established thought that it was going to completely change the face of elections. In fact, I think Tony Quinn, when that fight was going on, said that it would impact less than 10% of races in California. And he's probably somewhere in that ballpark, that it makes a lot fewer races a lot more important, or people are much more engaged in those, because all of a sudden those become the very, very competitive races in California. We still have, despite redistricting, a lot of our districts are still very strongly Democrat or strongly Republican. So I think that's why Eric's data show, while there was an increase in terms of those candidates from 18%, it wasn't like 100% of incumbents were challenged there. So what it did change was make primaries matter, because before you had all the Democrats would come out and vote for the Democratic candidate, and you didn't have any choice but to pull your own, party. And Republicans could come out and they could elect a Republican, and if you were a declined estate, which is this really growing mass of voters, you didn't have anywhere to go in the primary. And so it does change how, voting behavior at that, and maybe it's only at a marginal level, because declined estate voters still aren't generally coming out for those primary races, but it does give more voters a voice. And, it hasn't had that impact on turnout yet, but it could in the future, depending on how people approach races. In 2014, I think the general election really favored the business community in terms of turnout, the low turnout. The primary election favored labor. And so more conservative, more moderate voters came out in the fall of 2014. I think that's, in the last panel, Marty Wilson said that the June election went to labor and the fall election went to business. I think 2016 becomes a very important election cycle. Like I said, because of term limits, you're really defining what the legislature is going to look like for the next 10 to 12 years. But the general election in 2016 is going to favor labor. You're going to have higher voter turnout. You're going to have a lot younger voters. You're going to have more Democrats. Business needs to play in the primary. They're notoriously bad at spending money early and committing to candidates and doing their research, and that's going to be a challenge for the business community going into 2016. And they need to build a bench. Labor's also much stronger at building that bench going into those elections. So, I think there will also be a lot of strategy put into what Ruth was talking about, how many candidates are in those primaries, how do you play in those races to, either get your Republican on the ballot, but do you make a strategic choice that Republican in that district is so bad that you put money behind a more moderate or someone you believe to be a more moderate Democrat in order to win. And because primaries matter, as Steve knows very well, not him, but his opponent was so badly damaged in that primary that those races are going to impact the general election. And I think that, CTA looking back, they wanted to fight that fight early in the primary, but their candidate got so badly damaged in the primary, couldn't recover from it in the general election. And so those early fights, as they get bigger and uglier and nastier, it's going to change general elections as well.
So now we have the candidate perspective, which I know everybody's dying to hear about in the audience.
Dying. Thank you. I fondly recall being here 4 years ago because I had participated in managing Jerry Brown's campaign for governor, and we were doing the postmortem on that. Certainly a joyous occasion for Democrats who had been out of the governor's office for 21 of those past 28 years, and we'd overcome tremendous challenges to put a Democrat back in the governor's office, and what did that all mean, and how did that all happen? I'm also reminded 20 years ago, Clint Riley, who managed the campaign for Kathleen Brown, was here. I don't know if it was in this room. I decided not to attend, but it's in the book. And he famously, I believe, recalled saying that he felt like he was attending his own autopsy. Well, I'm not here attending my own autopsy because I'm alive and well, and still engaged in fighting for the things that I campaigned on, and I know there's a lot more exciting times ahead. In terms of advancing a more centrist view in these campaigns within the context of the open primary. I agree with, let me mention the things I agree with that have been said. I think that there has been incremental progress. I don't think it's a watershed. The open primaries created the watershed event that anyone that I know of expected. I do think, as Ruth indicated, that the field is a big deal. It's maybe a bigger deal than it's ever been. And that's a volatile equation. And I think if you look and break down some of these races, as Ruth did, I think you'll see that that mix of candidates can make a big deal. And those are things that were not available when you didn't have the open primary. I certainly don't remember much about turnout being the driver for the open primary versus a moderation of our politics, as someone earlier suggested. And you certainly can get some crocodile tears talking about the additional costs when you have to campaign and actually talk to people versus, I guess, go into your hovel and think about great governing ideas when you're elected. But I thought that the most interesting thing for me in going through it as a candidate, what's the broader observation, and that is that in the old days, a few years ago. These primaries, someone who's a centrist like me, wouldn't really have a chance in a primary. That they're dominated both on the left and the right by the extremes within the party. And I think that what's happening now, and it's very interesting, and I think it has a lot of potential consequences down the road, is that in the old days, the Democrats would run against a Republican in that general election, and they would do their best, and to some extent it works both ways, to demonize that opponent. They're the really bad. So for a Democrat, it's talking about the Republican is the, the corporate stooge working for the oil companies and the tobacco companies and the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies. And that was a very bad person, didn't represent the middle class families. And that was kind of the contest in terms of the framing of the race from the Democratic Party's point of view. But what's happened within the open primary now, when you have a more moderate Democrat running against someone who would be seen as more on the liberal side of the party, is that that same faction of power within the Democratic Party has a challenge on their hands, because they have to find a way to characterize and frame the centrists in a way that's bad, right? Among not just Democratic voters, but among everybody, because now that centrist is a big threat because they can pull from independents and they can pull from Republicans. So they know that the big enemy is that centrist. They'd much rather run against a Republican than run against a centrist Democrat in a runoff. And so the dilemma, certainly the situation for me in my race is that both sides didn't want to run against the centrist. So I got 21 negative mailers against me from the Democratic side and 11 from the Republican side, because it was in their interest not to run against someone like me. And I'd point out that both Republican and Democratic parties vigorously oppose the open primary. It's not a surprise to hear power within the party still lament the fact that we even have an open primary. So what happened in my race was that you had to have the Democratic interests that were fighting me had to now demonize me in a way that you typically wouldn't see. And so we heard earlier, the earlier panel talked about my position on BART as this extreme position that I had taken, that you shouldn't paralyze the entire Bay Area region because of a strike, and you should work it out at the bargaining table. That was my radical thought, which of course has been adopted by all the major urban areas in America. Transit can't strike in Washington or Chicago or New York or even San Francisco. But I had the notion that maybe that wasn't a good idea here. And so I was now part of the radical center, I guess. So they had to go after me. And so what they didn't fight with me in my race on BART, whether BART should strike or not, they didn't fight with me about my views on school issues or higher education issues or pension issues, that they had to now do what they would typically do to a Republican and demonize me. So here is someone who's been a Democrat their whole life, active in progressive causes for saving the environment and helping those in need, et cetera, electing a Democratic governor to run our state. They had to demonize someone like me. So one of my favorite props, so they put out 21 mailers demonizing me. This is one of my favorite mailers. We should get a close-up of this. I was the tobacco guy. That's me on the cover of a box of tobacco cigarettes. That I was the corporate Democrat who worked for tobacco and oil and insurance. And the case they had for that, there really was no case. They've never taken any money from tobacco. And it's not just one thing. This is the kind of stuff that you repeat over and over again. If you can't see this, this is me surrounded by cigarette butts. Okay. This is one of my favorite pieces because it's a nurse. And she says, "I'm too cozy with the tobacco industry." And this is the drumbeat, right? Now I had to be the really bad guy. And it's interesting, right? It's interesting. And, these certainly, you put out 21 of these things, they tend to take a toll on a candidate because it's, you do your best to fight back, and I certainly did my best. But it's interesting because I think it's going to create a greater fracture within our party, in the Democratic Party, because and I think it explains why there's shrinking membership within the party, affiliation with the party. That whether you say the Republicans are dropping faster, the proportion of people that don't feel like the parties speak to them anymore is a growing element. And I think it's a big challenge for the Democratic Party going forward, because as they continue to demonize people that had been loyal Democrats, the Chuck Reeds, the Antonio Villaragosas, the Kevin Johnsons, there's a collection of, there's the Gloria Romero, who took on school reform as her issue and has now been demonized, and now maybe the Steve Glazers. As you collect all these guys up, I think that we get a little more confidence that we should continue to speak out and try to really create a tipping point. And I think Eric's numbers don't show that we've reached it yet. But I think one thing that's clear is that the Democratic Party is controlled by some very powerful interests, and most Democrats who have ambition are intimidated by that circumstance. And they don't get any money if they don't toe the party line, and they don't get the support, they don't get the Democratic Party nomination. And that creates, I think, a lot of questioning about the Democratic Party that celebrates diversity of people, diversity of backgrounds, languages, color, but they don't accept diversity of opinion. And now if you have views that are different on schools, on pensions, on budget, now you're the devil, and maybe a bigger threat to the future of the interests that control the Democratic Party than even the Republican Party. And that's a very interesting dynamic to watch in the years ahead.
Well, a lot of interesting issues here and a lot to talk about. But, just sort of to follow up on that conversation, I'd love to get Courtni's thoughts on this as well. You talked about divisive partisan fights, and you're talking about the fracturing of the parties, and that's leading to more unaffiliated voters. But those independent voters aren't turning out. So at the end of the day, what's a path to victory for a more centrist Democrat like yourself, or even a centrist Republican? I know those dynamics are different. But how does this play with the role of the parties? And I mean, Prop 14 was talked about weakening parties. But now endorsements are more important, and those partisan cues are now more important. So, how do you balance all of that? To either anybody on the panel, but Courtni or Steve, if you want to start.
Feel free, Steve.
Well, I think that I think it's a problem for the Democrats, because I think that there's a lot of really passionate activists within the Democratic Party, as I know in the Republican Party, and they think that they really are in charge, and it's not really true. Tomorrow in Senate District 7, happen to have an interest in that, the Democratic Party is getting together to decide endorsements. I've declined to participate in the Democratic Party endorsement process in my assembly race, and I'm declining to participate in it in my Senate race. But I asked an interesting question today. I said, how many voting delegates are there? And he said 141. And I said, when did ballots go out? And they said 2 weeks ago. I filed a week ago, by the way. They said the ballots went out 2 weeks ago. And I said, okay. And I said, how many of those delegates are typically represented by, appointed by members of the legislature? And the Senate Assembly get 11. 11. And I said, well, how many of those who are voting tomorrow represent elected officials, that 141? And he said 86. 86. What that means is that if you're an assembly person from Marin or Fremont and you like one of the candidates, you appoint someone to be on the central committee that lives in those areas. That's what happens. It's the stacking of the deck. And so you have all these powerful interests around the elected officials and around the party leadership, and they know what they want. And the activists think they're going to go and it's going to make a difference tomorrow, but I suggest that it doesn't. So it's a problem for the Democratic Party. There are so many members of the Democratic Party leadership that have a greater association with an interest group than with the party ideals. And if you ask them to choose between a stance on a particular issue that their interests represents and the party interests, there's no question about where they come down. And most activists in the Democratic Party have no clue. Most of the money that comes from the Democratic Party to candidates comes from these powerful interests. They don't come from individuals. You may think it's your $5 contribution that you're making each month. And I think that as they understand that, hopefully they'll take back the party from the interests that control it today.
So two things to your original question. First of all, I actually do not believe that the Democratic Party is not made up of individuals. Yes, there are interests that give to the Democratic Party, but many of those interests, just the panel before us, you had a young woman who was from the Realtors Association that represented roughly X amount of homeowners. I was with labor for many years, and COPE dollars were voluntary dollars by individual rank and file members that they would give and donate to candidates or parties. And so I would argue that those things are part of the mix of donors of the Democratic Party. In terms of, I think one of the things that you said earlier, the fact that there's this rising decline to state or lack of people that are joining the Democratic Party, I think Part of that could be our own success. We are aggressively always registering new voters, but if anybody in this room, and I know many of you have ever done a voter registration drive outside of canvassing or tabling a market or whatever a traditional methods, going door to door is one of the hardest, most time-intensive discussions, and you do have to have a discussion, particularly if you look at the rising first-generation immigrant influx of Latinos and many Asian American or Asian ethnic subpopulations that are coming here. Like, it's not like as soon as you get there, they automatically understand Democratic, Republican. I mean, there is some, I think, early education and outreach that needs to happen. And in spite of that, the fact that we are getting more people to become citizens, and we're attempting aggressively to do voter registration and other activities, that we really have to do that outreach early. I just don't think that it is simple as black and white in terms of the Democratic Party is sort of failing to garner this new electorate.
No, absolutely. I mean, so bring this to the top two. I mean, at the end of the day, you've now got same party races. You had 20 of them in 2012, 18 this last cycle. You've had some upsets like the Boca Negra race. At the end of the day, there's mixed signals about whether top two has really changed the way people govern. We saw Eric's data here. But at the end of the day, do you feel like when you go into candidate campaigns that people are saying, look, I'm a little bit more worried about my place here, so I have to govern differently, I have to look at my race differently, I've got to cast the net wider, and if I'm in a Dem-on-Dem race, I've got to talk to Republicans or vice versa with Reaps? I mean, what are you sort of getting on the ground from candidates or from IEs? I mean, just going back to that last IE panel, they were talking about how in the Sacramento race, they had to talk to Republicans. That's a new dynamic, and so how does that play out?
Well, I think for the business community, the irony of being between Courtni here and Steve here is an interesting juxtaposition, and I think Ethan probably planned it that way. But I think that's where it puts Republicans and the business community sometimes in those races where there is a broader conversation, and we can have conversations where previously the business community didn't feel like it could be part of the conversation. When when it was decided in the primary, Democrats went hard left and Republicans went hard right. It changes that conversation, and it allows the business community to talk to candidates about across the spectrum about where they are on multiple issues. And again, I don't think it's going to it's not going to change every race in the state. It's going to be certain races that are already competitive, Republican Democrat races that are already competitive, Dem on Dem and Reap on Reap, and that's a very small number. It's not going to be this sea change in the legislature, and I think that candidates do have to pay attention because they know that, and particularly in those races, they know that people are going to be having that conversation, and they can't sit on their laurels and not be engaged in it. So.
And I think just to add a little bit, I mean, I think it also, you can't separate a specific race in a specific district and generalize over everything. So obviously with top two, you now have in certain races where you have two Democrats running and 17% of the electorate are Republicans, or 20% of Republicans, you're going to have to craft a message to Republicans. And it may actually be part of your strategy, both in the primary, actually, to make sure, and also in the general. But then you have other districts, for instance, the Chu Campos race in San Francisco and the, in the East Bay, where really there are so few Republicans, you actually you don't have to deal with it. And I think you have to remember, it's an incredibly diverse state, as we all know. There are really no rules. And you also have races, and we've done them as well, where maybe you get the more moderate candidate, but it's also because the other candidate really was just never a strong candidate anyway. So it wasn't just about the message or crafting a message, it was because that was the candidate that just became the stronger candidate for a number of reasons, potentially because they could raise money, or sometimes you have the more progressive. So I think it's very, very hard to generalize. And many of these things that Steve was talking about the power of a party endorsement things, a lot of that happened in the old system as well. So, really, is it that different? Is it that much different now? It's hard to tell. I mean, I think it's too soon to see really how it's going to impact.
I think it's also one thing to keep in mind is that California actually had a similar kind of primary system in the late 90s, 98, 2000, called the blanket primary. It was basically the same thing. In the first round, it was the same thing as the top two. That is, voters got to vote for whomever they wanted, from race by race. So it was just like a first stage general in that sense. But unlike the top two, you advanced the top vote getter from within each party to the fall campaign. And so there was no chance of a same party contest in the fall. And the evidence from that system is that there was a small bump up in moderation, especially in the assembly and to a certain extent in the congressional delegation. We never got a chance to see if that persisted or if it was a blip or if it was a function of something else that was going on around the same time, because the Supreme Court overturned that system and now it's gone. What's that? Yeah, so they said that's, but the reason we have the top two now and have approached the reform the way we do now is because the Supreme Court has basically said that this is okay, like this is a constitutionally acceptable way to do it, and the blanket was not. But the point that I want to make is just that we did see some bump up in moderation under that system, but it was only in certain specific. For certain people, right? It wasn't a blanket change across all districts. And I think the thing that we should be, if we believe that the top two is going to have some effect on the way the legislature operates or on the composition of the congressional delegation, I think we need to see it in places where you would expect to see it, as opposed to seeing sort of some kind of uniform shift across all districts. And so it shouldn't be something that is happening everywhere and to everyone. It should be something that is dependent on the kind of race that's emerging in any particular place.
Just because we're running out of time, the constitutional offices, this was the first year that top two actually was in operation for these offices. We didn't see any changes. We didn't see Dem on Dem, Reap on Reap races, though the controller race was pretty close. We did see a viable, nonpartisan candidate with Dan Schnur in the Secretary of State, questionable, to some, but, he did get a lot of ink, but, what's your sort of dissection of that campaign? I mean, he also talked about how, he had a Dem and Reap consultant. They didn't anticipate turnout to be as low as it was, and I think a lot of other candidates didn't look at that as the same way. I mean, what's your take? I mean, are we going to see nonpartisan candidates rise up the ranks over time, or is that still a really big stretch? Do parties sort of have the imprimatur here?
It depends. A lot of it is going to depend on money. So, if an independent, if George Clooney decided tomorrow he wanted to run for Senate, the whole race would change, right? You can't, oh, it's my dream.
With her thumbs up, by the way. I want to put that on the record.
But, I think that we can't, this constitutional, this election, obviously incredibly low turnout. And what happened was a lot of what, and we talked about that a front runner or incumbent status is very, very hard to beat. And honestly, it's kind of the same thing that probably would have happened if there had been a primary and a general. So there would have been a primary, Jerry Brown would have won the primary, and then there would have been a general, and he would have won that. So, I don't know that, it would have actually been that different. And I think an independent, we'll see. There's obviously some room for it, and it really has to, it's going to be the right candidate.
Well, I have 2 words to explain what happened to Dan. Leland Yee. Because that says it all, right? were people really paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, I think nothing has really changed about the fundamental history of the United States, which is you're only going to see a successful third-party candidate if they themselves have star power. If like George Clooney, whatever. I mean, that's what we've seen. I mean, Ross Perot was for all of his quirks, was a star, right? I mean, he had a lot of money, and so he could kind of leapfrog over the whole system. But otherwise, voters do see things through a partisan lens, and it's very helpful to them. It helps them organize politics, and that doesn't mean that you can't have people making distinctions between candidates within a party, but that it's significantly more difficult. And when you have a no-party preference candidate, again, if they could somehow leapfrog over the process, Dan Schnur actually had more money than Pete Peterson, but he just couldn't quite. You got to have even more, right? You got to be sort of above and beyond, because you're having to clear that hurdle that says not just let me tell you about myself, but since I don't have a party label, I got to tell you even more about myself, so you know exactly what I am and that I'm not going to try and pull the wool over your eyes. So I think that makes it a challenge for a no party preference candidate. Again, not that it can't be done, but just that they start out with a major disadvantage.
Oh, go ahead, Steve.
What Eric said. Just to put some meat on the bones, because there's a threshold that you have to get to even get your voice heard at all in California. And it's not, $1 million is nothing. It's nothing. A week's worth of television is multi-million dollars for 1 week. So, $5 million. Okay, $5 million. That's because you're paying the corporate rate. The candidate rate's a little bit less, maybe 40% less. So I don't think there's clarity there. I don't think there's clarity there. So
before we throw it out to the audience, I mean, what is there sort of the big surprise? Anything you didn't anticipate with top two that has sort of come to the forefront where it's actually forced you to throw out the old playbook and sort of reinvent how you campaign and how you give advice to your candidates and to your IE committees?
I think that primaries matter changes that. I mean, you have to be much more strategic a lot earlier about what the field looks like, about who you give to, about who you get behind. I think, but it's not in every race. It's really in those target races. It's not in 120 districts in California. It's in 12 or 20 districts in California where you start to really engage. So it allows, and that's why you see so much money in those races, is because fewer races are decided by voters. I mean, really, truly by that election turnout that they're really on those margins. Most of the races in California are still decided in the primary. And so it changes how you look at a handful of them, but it doesn't globally change everything you're doing, but it really changes how you look at those handful of races, those 24 races maybe.
Well, I'll go old school. And that is, if you're going to be successful, certainly if you're a centrist, whether it's Republican or Democrat, spend time in that community, be of that community. Find a collection of people that share your view, build a donor base, volunteer, get involved, connect. And if you're going to not be beholden to a powerful interest that has the checkbook, you got to build it within those communities. And that means being involved early and often, and building a donor base so that you're not dependent upon those contributions. And that's old school. And it's tough in big places like Assembly and Senate districts. But I do think that party label does matter, and it's a challenge. And the field, there's some things you can and can't control there. But I think that if you want to have a chance, you've got to build a coalition of people that understand what you're about and how you would independently represent them. And that's not easy to do, but that requires a lot of work and a lot of time. It's not dependent upon the power within the interests in the party that we have today.
All right, so I guess we'll open it up to questions in the audience. All right, right here in the third row here, Deborah.
Steve, I'd like to hear what you have to say, and anyone else who wants to chime in also. if your race had been a traditional Republican versus Democratic, Democratic primary versus Republicans later, would Catherine Baker have won?
No. It is a district that's a +7 Democratic district, but certainly what happened in the primary contributed, both in soiling the image of the Democratic nominee, Tim Sabranti, but it also, convinced someone like me that, where were they on the issues I cared about? And at the end of the day, I felt that Catherine Baker, the Republican, was closer to the issues that I cared about, and I made that clear to those that supported me. But I don't think that that district has had many. It was viewed as a swing district over the course of many elections. It used to be represented by a Republican, Lynn Leach, Guy Houston. Used to have Congressman Bill Baker in the Senate and in the Congress. And then Abrams Wilson, the mayor of San Ramon, or the Republican nominee, had a big fight with Joan Buchanan, 2 cycles to try to take that seat back for the Republicans, and was not successful. So I think that given the reshaping of the district, it is certainly a lean Democratic district or better, and I think that Catherine Baker would not have been successful had what happened in the primary.
All right. Katie, or
Katie Merrill, thanks you guys. Ruth, you were talking about the field and the filing deadline and the sort of notion that you think you're starting with a certain number of candidates and then all of a sudden, a week before the primary, 3 more jump in. I'm asking anybody on the panel, is there any evidence that there are more candidates now running in primaries because of the open primary than before when we had the closed?
We certainly had more in 2012. I can't recall for 2014, but the challenge with 2012 is there was also a redistricting, and that, you saw that first slide I put up, which I think is in some ways the most important question, which is are incumbents, are people willing to go up against very powerful people in the primaries? Because, when you had an open seat, there was always a lot of candidates who would come up for a primary election under the old system too. And that's definitely up, but not as much in 2014 as 2012, and that's because of the redistricting, I think. It's just that things have settled down, people know what the districts are, they figure some of these people are going to be around for a while, and but I think it is a little bit higher, yeah.
If you remember back in what we call the very quiet time, during when there were no term limits and no open primary. There were very few races in the primaries because there were no term limits. Everyone stayed in office, and we didn't. And then there was no redistricting. They were all kind of safe seats. So it's really you can't really tie it to top 2. I think it's related to other things.
And just to follow up on that, do you think there's going to be some more discipline that's going to be exerted on, from the party side? I know we've had this discussion already, but will parties have to adapt and evolve with the top 2?
I think they'd be smart to. I don't know if they will. I think when you have a hold on power and you don't want to give it up, that you tend to. No one says that the king doesn't have, the emperor doesn't have any clothes, so. They get less tolerant of divergent views, and more the walls go up and they're defending the castle on the hill. So I think it'd be smart if they appreciated diversity of thought and participation and recognized the party is better for having that. A substantive example, people get criticized, folks like me who say we need pension reform. It's not because we don't think people who work their whole life are deserving of a fair pension. It's that if you have a system that's not financially viable, it's not going to help the next newly hired police officer and firefighter and teacher. But so they don't want to have the discussion because they say they don't want the discussion, period. Don't mess around with something that's sensitive to us. And it's like, no, we're trying to save it. We're trying to make sure it's there for long term in the future. But see, that's a radical thought for some. And yet from a centrist, it's like, no. This isn't about blowing something out of the water here. It's about trying to have a system that's stable, that governing can last longer. And I think that they're just not accepting of that right now. I hope that they will be.
Well, definitely a lot to watch there. We've got, I guess we've got this gentleman in the front who's raised his hand.
Yeah, C.T. Weber. I'm from one. Oh, sorry. I'm from one of the alternative parties in California. We feel we've suffered because of top two. There's been an 85% drop in all the number of candidates, not just in the general election, but in the primary election, because once you had that, you had other changes that had to be implemented along with top two. So I call it the only two, because it's you used to have 6 candidates running, for statewide races, and you'd have all those races filled, and now you only have 2. And I think it goes against what they said. They said we're going to have more candidates, and we have less.
All right, we'll take last 2 questions. The gentleman in the back here.
In my opinion, one of the most interesting candidates for statewide office in 2014 was Ellen Brown. She had excellent academic credentials. She was an absolute expert on the subject of the virtues of having a state bank. She was the Green Party candidate for treasurer. She ran not because she thought she'd win, but she thought, as a candidate, she'd have a forum and she could talk about this novel idea. But because of top two, of course, she was wiped out in June. She never got any publicity. And so I want to underscore, C.T. Weber, our society for hundreds of years has depended on people who run for office not because they expect to be elected, but because they have something important to say that nobody else is saying. And we have lost that. So I'd like you to comment.
Okay. All right, last question here. The woman in the blue here.
I live in the Bay Area, so I get all the TV. And I thought that 8016 was probably, and I'd like to know for those of you who look at it statewide, probably the most negative campaign, primary and general, in the entire state. And my other question is, in that, that's related, where we do have 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats running against each other in the general, do they tend to be more polite, more civil, because not wanting to criticize too badly someone of the same party? And is really kind of a duller election, if you will?
So is there more civility in these same party races? We've got the shaking heads. All right, well, I know this is we've passed the 6 o'clock hour, and Ethan has asked me to make an announcement that tomorrow breakfast starts at 9:30. Wanted to thank the panelists again for joining us this evening.